Hi there, Alex here at mixinglessons.com. In this video, I want to talk about EQing your music, and specifically the ways in which we potentially EQ music a little bit differently depending on the kind of EQ plugin that we're using. So you can see here, I've got two plugins loaded. I've got this plugin, which is the kind of stock EQ in Pro Tools. And then I've also loaded up the API Vision channel strip. And so here we are just focusing on this EQ filter section of the channel strip. Now, this isn't a comparison of these two plugins specifically. It's more an observation about the way that we approach EQing music differently depending on what kind of functionality the EQ plugin offers us. So if we take a look at the Pro Tools EQ first, let's have a look at what kind of functionality this kind of plugin gives us. So as you can see, we can make 5 adjustments to the frequency spectrum. The adjustment to the high frequency and the low frequency can either be shelves like this. So these apply either a boost or a cut over what's known as a transition band, and then that boost or cut remains constant all the way to the end of the frequency spectrum. Or they can be a bell shape. And then the low mid frequency, the mid frequency, and the high mid frequency are also bell shapes or bell curves. Now, this plugin gives us a great deal of control over the kind of change that we're making to the frequency spectrum. So for each of these, you have a Q setting, and that controls how broad or narrow each of these changes are that you make. Similarly, with the high shelf or the low shelf, you can control how steep or gradual that transition band is. And you also have a great deal of control over the specific frequency that you are making this change at. So you can see here, you can sweep through the frequency spectrum and find exactly which frequency you would like this change to happen at. Similarly, with the gain, you can move in very small increments to make very, very specific changes as to how much boost or cut you're applying to that frequency band. So this plugin gives you a great deal of control over the kind of change that you make to the frequency spectrum. You can be very specific about the decibel amount of boost or cut that you make. You can be very specific about which frequency is at the center of this bell curve that you're making, or the point at which you are applying your high or low shelf. And you can be very specific about how broad or narrow these changes are that you make. Now let's take a look at the EQ section on the API Vision channel strip. Here you can make 4 changes to the frequency spectrum. So we have a high frequency option, high mid frequency, low mid frequency, and low frequency. Once again, the low frequency and the high frequency can be either a bell or a shelf. Here you can choose which frequency you are making the change at, and you can choose how much you turn that frequency up or down. But rather than having that granular control over how much you're turning the frequency up or down, or exactly which frequency you're boosting or cutting, here you're selecting from a set of predetermined options. So here you could choose to make a change at 800 Hz, 1.5K, 3K, and you could say, I want to turn this frequency up 2 decibels, 4 decibels. So you don't have that kind of control that you have with this kind of plugin. Similarly, with this plugin, you don't have a Q setting, so you don't have control over how broad or narrow that changes that you're making. If you're using a shelf, you don't have control over how steep or gradual the slope is on that shelf. And so you're not able to do what you can do in this plugin, which is to get very, very specific about the exact settings of each parameter on the plugin. Now, as I say, this is not a comparison of these two plugins in particular. This is an observation about the way we work when we have more or less parameters or options available to us. Now, I find that it is necessary to have a plugin like this in your list of plugins, to have it at your disposal, because there will be times where you want to pinpoint a very specific frequency, and perhaps you want to notch that frequency out. Maybe there's a resonant peak somewhere and you want to kind of notch that frequency out, or you want to make a very, very specific adjustment to the frequency spectrum. But I think when you use this kind of plugin all the time, it can lead you to overthinking things. So let's say I want to add more bite to an electric guitar. I know that generally that's going to happen somewhere around 2 to 5K. Now, if we just reset this plugin, I find that with this kind of plugin, I can kind of overthink this process a little bit because I've got to find the ideal gain amount. I've got to find the exact frequency specifically that I want as the center frequency for this bell curve. And I want to decide how broad or narrow the changes that I make. And I find that I can spend a lot of time kind of obsessing over very, very small changes, very, very granular changes. Is it better at 3.5? Is it better at 3? Is it better at 2? Is it better at 2.5? And so on. Also, does it sound better at 2 decibels? Or does it sound better at 1.3 decibels? And again, how broad or narrow should that change be? Whereas when you use a plugin like this, I have the option to select 3K or 5K. Or if I use this as a bell setting, I can set it to 2.5K in this frequency band. And then I can choose, do I turn this up 2 decibels, 4 decibels? So I don't have that really specific level of control. And so let's just try that out. Let's send some guitar into this plugin. Let's bypass this one. And let's have a listen to those 3 options that I essentially have. I would say that each of those options does what I'm looking for. They all add bite to the electric guitar. And so it's a case of deciding which of those options, which of those 3 frequencies are most appropriate for the mix and how much I want to turn that frequency up. And so I find that in general, when you're using an EQ which has less options, which does what it does very well, but doesn't give you control over quite so many parameters, I find that the process for EQing music becomes a lot more intuitive. For me, I found that this way of doing things can be more natural. It's certainly quicker because you make decisions based on a few options rather than overthinking very small changes. And I find that I'm still just as happy with the results because you could say, if you have less options, surely you're not being as specific about the way you're EQing, and therefore the results aren't going to be as good. Actually, I haven't found that to be the case. I've actually found that a lot of the time I'm happier with the results using this kind of EQ than I am when I spend a great deal of time tweaking very small changes with this type of EQ. But that said, there will be times where you do need that level of control, where you do need to be that specific. But I don't think it's always necessary or even beneficial to always have that level of control. I think that you can do a lot of your EQing with a plugin which offers you a little bit less control, but then perhaps you can reach for a tool which gives you a lot more control when you need it, when you need that level of specificity in the EQ change that you're making. Now, we've talked a lot about frequencies in this video, and I mentioned that, I know that the bite on an electric guitar is going to be somewhere between 2 and 5K. Obviously, knowing which frequency to hone in on to make these kinds of changes to different instruments is really important. And that's why I've created a free EQ cheat sheet, which covers which frequencies you should focus on to get various different characteristics out of drums, bass guitar, electric guitar, acoustic guitar, and vocals. You can get that cheat sheet completely free when you head over to mixinglessons.com/free-downloads. And that also comes bundled with a free compression cheat sheet and a free vocal recording guide to take the guesswork out of these 3 very important elements of producing music: the EQ, the compression, and the recording of vocals. If you want to go a little bit more in depth on exactly what kind of change you can make with something like a shelf filter, for example, when you are EQing music, then I'd recommend you to check out this video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.